We put extra padding in just for you. And then you'll just be able to turn on the mic. You got water.
Yes, I didn't.
Oh, miss.
I want to sit here.
We can play musical chairs.
Thank you.
If everyone could take their seats and silence their phones now, we're going to get ready for our next panel discussion, Lessons in Economic Statecraft. Our moderator is going to be Eric Lorber with the Financial Integrity Network, and I'll hand it over to him from here.
Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eric Lorber, and I'm, as he said, with the Financial Integrity Network, and this is the panel on Lessons in Economic Statecraft. And we couldn't be luckier today to have 4 amazing panelists join us who have been longtime practitioners and scholars on this topic. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll briefly introduce them and then just go directly to peppering them with questions. On my immediate left is the Honorable Adam Zubin. Adam is currently an of counsel at the law firm Sullivan Cromwell and a practitioner in residence at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Prior to that, he was the acting Treasury Secretary. Prior to that, he was the acting Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And prior to that, he was the Director of OFAC at Treasury. So no stranger to sanctions issues. To his left, we have the Honorable Daniel Glazer. Danny is a principal at FIN, the Financial Integrity Network, and prior to that, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and prior to that, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. To his left, we have Dr. Matthew Levitt. Dr. Levitt is the director of the Stein Program on Counterterrorism at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Intelligence and Analysis. And then finally, we have Dr. Samantha Ravich. Samantha Ravich is currently a senior advisor at the Chertoff Group, where she works on issues related to cyber-enabled economic warfare, among other things. And she was Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. So I guess the first question I want to start off with for all panelists is that in the past few years, we've seen instances of sanctions unwinding in ways we haven't seen before. So in the case of Burma, in the case of the Sudan General License, in the case of Iran as a result of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, what lessons do you think these episodes of sanctions unwinding tell us about how to successfully do this in the future? So I guess I'll just go down the line if you want to start, Adam.
Is my microphone? It's a big question. I'll focus on just one narrow aspect because the others on the panel are going to have, no doubt, a lot to contribute here as well. So the only thing that comes to mind, or the main thing that comes to mind when you raise the question, is flexibility. With sanctions, the name of the game is to change behavior. That's what sanctions are for. They're not meant to be punitive tools. And if you think of them in that way, if you think of them as leverage, the question becomes, who's exercising that leverage and how easy is it to use? And the question is really brought to the fore right now. There's a bill that the Senate has passed that's gone over to the House with Iran and Russia sanctions. And the Russia side of it has a very extensive codification provision that goes beyond what Congress has done in the past on Cuba and on Iran, and attempts to really hem this or any future administration in with respect to what they can do on loosening sanctions, even to the extent of OFAC issuing a license. In certain cases would have to come before Congress, and you'd have to have both houses vote. That's an unprecedented level of congressional control, and so some of that goes to separation of powers, and that's always going to be a rivalry. But your question brings up the issue of, does the adversary, the target of the sanctions, believe that if they take the steps that are being called for, the sanctions will be eased in a commensurate way? or do they believe that it's the sanctions are permanent or close to permanent? And I don't know what the answer is necessarily in terms of where we put the balance, but I know that if we do get to a place where targets of sanctions don't believe that the sanctions can or will be lifted, then we've undermined the tool entirely.
There we go. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a good question. I think it's an interesting question, and my answer is actually going to be a little bit out of the orthodoxy of how we generally talked about this at the Treasury Department, and it, to be honest with you, reflects sort of an evolution of thought I've had on this subject for some time now. Because I think Adam's completely right. The issue becomes one of flexibility and predictability, and the ability of the people who are imposing the sanctions to be able to be as sophisticated in the lifting of those sanctions as they were in the application of those sanctions. When we were sort of devising these tools and developing these tools over sort of a 10 to 15 year period at the Treasury Department, and Matt and Adam and myself were very much a part of that team that was doing that, we tended to focus on what I would call conduct-based targeted measures. And there became an orthodoxy began to surround that there's this presumption that conduct-based measures are always the right measure. And there's some sense to that, right? It feels fairer. It feels fair to sanction somebody because of specific illicit conduct that person's involved with. It's easier to get other people to buy into it. It's easier to talk about. It's easier to get a multilateral framework going with respect to it. So there's a lot of good reasons to use conduct-based measures, and there's some sanctions programs that are conduct-based by definition. Terrorist-related sanctions are always going to be conduct-based by definition. Proliferation sanctions are always going to be conduct-based by definition. But when you're talking, as you are, about more sort of country-related programs, I think it becomes more questionable whether we always want to use conduct-based measures, because the question is, what happens? I mean, this is always the question. It was the question with North Korea. It was the question with Iran. What happens when the politics change but the conduct doesn't change? So what happens when you come to a political arrangement, maybe a very good political arrangement, maybe a really, really good political arrangement that you come to with the country that's the target of the sanctions, and you want to lift, but your sanctions have been imposed for conduct that hasn't really changed. It's a problem. It was a problem with North Korea. It's potentially a problem with Iran, and I think it could be a problem moving forward. And for that and other reasons, I really do think it makes sense to think more seriously about more status-based sanctions when you're talking about a jurisdictional target. You could still do your targeting based on conduct. You could still do your targeting based on conduct, but it frees you up. It frees you up to when you do want to roll it back. To make what is actually a political decision, to make that political decision and say, okay, maybe we targeted this particular, Kyrgyzstan government official. Maybe we targeted this guy because he was involved in an invasion of a neighboring country. Well, now that's where the politics of that have been resolved. We could just lift it. We can just lift it. Because actually he was just, the reason why he was targeted was, the legal reason is because he's a Kyrgyz government official. It's just based on status. And so then you don't have to get into this sort of whole, sort of kabuki about whether the conduct has changed. So if you want to know what lesson I've learned from sort of our experience in trying to do this, I do think one of the lessons to get at what Adam's talking about, to get to the flexibility that I think government decision makers need, is to understand that conduct-based targeted measures are one tool in our arsenal, and one that we should use. But I don't think it's the only tool, and I don't think it's necessarily the best tool. People use the term smart sanctions, a term that I don't like, as a synonym for conduct-based targeted measures. But I don't know necessarily that that's always the smartest option. So that's my lesson.
You heard it here. Danny wants dumb sanctions. First of all, those are great answers, but can we just get some recognition that Eric introduced all of us with all of that background with no notes? That was very impressive.
I have them here, but.
But you
yeah.
didn't look at them. I was watching you. You're famous. I'm infamous. So just 3 quick points. The first is, to echo some of what you've already heard, sanctions are a tool, not an end. And we need to think about what we're trying to achieve, and we need to push back when people, and they always do, misunderstand what we're trying to do with these tools. Latest example you might have seen is an article in Foreign Affairs arguing that we should not follow the money on the counterterrorism side because almost 16 years after 9/11, there are more terrorist groups, they've got more money, the war on terror financing has failed. It missed the point on what these tools were trying to do over and over and over again. And that's true on other sanctions, different types of sanctions regimes as well. We have to constantly educate what we are trying to do and what we're not trying to do. The second thing I think we need to keep in mind is, I think it's really important to recognize it's not a bad thing at all when we roll back sanctions if the goals we were trying to achieve are being achieved. But I think we have to be very, very careful only to roll back sanctions when the behaviors or the underlying reason for the sanctions have changed. And to me, and Dan, you touched on this briefly, to me the key example is North Korea. This was a battle I fought and lost in the Bush administration when we were all in. We took North Korea off of for terrorism sanctions, but we did it basically because of the 6-party talks. And my feeling was fine, but then we should produce a paper that argues North Korea is no longer involved in the terrorist activities. And you could make that case. It might be contested, but you can make that case, and that wasn't done. The decision was, no, we'll do it for whatever reason we want. And I felt that really undermined our sanctions. It provided our adversaries with an example that wasn't really true, but to say, you see, these guys, they just sanction anybody they want for any reason, and then they take them off for any reason they want. I felt it severely undermined our authorities. And finally, I think that when you do roll back sanctions, and here the JCPOA is a good example, we need to be very clear what we are and what we are not rolling back. I felt that we did nowhere near as good a job as we could have in articulating our position that this was not the end of all sanctions when it comes to Iran. When the governor of the Central Bank of Iran came to Washington and spoke at the Council of Foreign Relations and elsewhere and said, quote, the sanctions era is over, we didn't push back hard enough. And that makes a difference because then when I go to Europe, or others, I'm sure in the government go to Europe, the Europeans will echo that. The sanctions era is over. And you need to educate them. Actually, JCPOA was only about certain sanctions. And if Iran continues to engage in ballistic missile production and human rights violations and sponsoring terrorism, those types of sanctions are still very much on the table. And so we need to be much more careful about how, not whether we do or don't, but how we roll back the sanctions and how we articulate what we are and are not doing.
So I worry about whether or not the age of sanctions is actually coming to a close, because when we look back as to why some of our sanctions, have been successful in the past, at least 3 of the reasons are, one, we're talking about economic statecraft, and we're the #1 economy in the world. And with that comes the strength of using that economic leverage to get what we want and to stop bad actors from doing things we don't want them to do. We're able to use that leverage. The second reason is because in the past we've been able to build successful coalitions to augment our power and our ability to leverage sanctions by getting others to adhere to that as well. And number 3, kind of going back to number 1, is the dollar is king. So what's changing? What's changing that makes me concerned about the future of using economic statecraft in the way that we have used it in the past, which is this is mostly accrues to our benefit and our ability to use it, right? I do think that the world is changing a lot on this front. On the first, right, us as the #1 economy, we still are the #1 economy. Where it gets very tricky are the very systems that we rely on, the very networks that we rely on to make us the #1 economy, also make us incredibly vulnerable now to asymmetric threats from the likes of a North Korea, right? In the past, we could put sanctions on North Korea without any kind of economic blowback. What kind of economic blowback would North Korea have against us, right? Okay, now cut to they use cyber means in order to undermine some of our economic base in order to weaken us politically and militarily, right? They hack into the banks. I mean, look, all you need to do is, Google North Korean hacks on South Korean economy, and you'll be amazed at what they've done over the last few years in terms of undermining the South Korean economy. So it's a great asymmetric tool for them that in the past we never had to worry about when we thought about what would be the blowback for some of our economic statecraft against an actor such as North Korea. And the second point, us being able to build coalitions. The bad guys are building coalitions at a pretty good clip. And in ways that I think that we may not be, fully comprehending in terms of how it could constrain our actions and, again, blowback for us. I think that we have to be thinking about injecting a sense of robustness into the kind of coalitions that we can build because we are coalition on coalition, and we could talk more about this, the coalitions that the bad guys are doing. And the third point, and this hasn't really been realized yet, but it's something, again, to think in mind as we think about our sanctions and our economic statecraft. Again, we kind of presuppose that dollar is king, dollar remain king, so when we do economic statecraft and kind of constrain international monetary flows, we can do it by constraining the dollar. By leveraging that strength. There are alt currencies coming into play. There are other ways for illicit finance so that the bad guys can get the kind of money evade sanctions in new ways that frankly I think hamper what we've kind of all grown up with in how to use these tools. So too soon to say they're dead, but clearly there are forces present and that are ramping up that I think make it perhaps more difficult, certainly in need of a relook about how we can get what we need from this tool.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I wanted to build on your first point about vulnerabilities in the U.S. system. And obviously, in the past couple of years, you've seen situations where the North Koreans have used cyber theft as a way to enrich sort of their coffers. You've seen China actually begin to use economic sanctions on its own, for example, against South Korean companies that are supporting the deployment of the THAAD missile system. And you've, of course, in the case of the GCC, seen recently list-based sanctions imposed or designations imposed against Qatar. So to what extent do you think the United States can defend itself against sort of these various types of economic actions that may threaten U.S. interests? And I can go to any third. Sam,
yeah, I'll just quickly start, and then turn it over. We are not in the best defensive position that we need to be. Again, I focus on cyber-enabled economic warfare, the adversarial use of cyber means to undermine portions of our economy in order to weaken us militarily and politically. And while we have wonderful offensive capabilities in this realm, our castle walls are just not strong enough. Again, the strength of our military rests on the fact that we are the strength of our economy. The strength of our economy rests on the fact of our intellectual property base, on the fact that we create and move capital through networks, and those are just not secure. So, in your answer, I think we have wonderful offensive means that we can and should, fully explore, not just in the cyber realm, but, our whole tool basket, but as we really push on these, we better make sure the castle walls are strong enough.
I think we're kind of merging two separate issues. One, the question of cyber warfare and how vulnerable we are to that. And Sam's certainly one of the world's experts on that, and it doesn't take too much to understand that we're highly vulnerable to it. We see it all the time, how our adversaries, whether it's Russia or North Korea or other places, are able to exploit those vulnerabilities to harm us in a variety of ways. I think that's a separate question from the question of whether we continue to have the ability to apply economic pressure on jurisdictional targets. and whether and the related question of whether those jurisdictional targets have the ability to apply similar economic pressure on us. There's always going to be issues of asymmetric threats, and that's something that we're going to have to grapple with, whatever tool we use as we engage with these adversaries. There's always going to, whether it's a financial tool we use, whether it's a kinetic tool we use, whether it's some other tool that we use, there's always going to be the problem of an asymmetrical response that we need to understand and we need to defend ourselves against. But with respect to applying economic pressure on a target, the United States continues to have the ability to do that, and I certainly understand the notion that there's these sort of broad international global economic trends which might say that over time that ability is going to erode, and I think that ability will erode over a course of decades. But there is nothing right now. There is nothing in the world right now to take the place of the dollar. Nothing is going to take the place of the dollar in the short to medium term future. As long as we're responsible custodians of the dollar, nothing is going to emerge or take its place. So we still have that type of leverage that nobody has a symmetrical response to. Now, I do think that our ability to use that leverage is almost infinitely enhanced, as Sam said, by our ability to form coalitions and by our ability to work with allies. That's something that I think has been remarkably degraded recently, and something that I think that we need to consider how we work with countries around the world to expand our ability to apply pressure on a target. Because just to take North Korea as an example, for 25 years now we've been trying to figure out the right sort of formula for applying economic pressure. I think that we touched upon it for a very brief time. About 10 years ago, we were able to actually put them on their heels, and then that moment passed, and I think that moment's gone. And at this point, it's only through cooperation with the Chinese that we could be able to apply the type of economic pressure on North Korea that we would need to apply. So I do think that this is a real tool that we have. I think it's one that we need to be smart about. Smart, but I think and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. So I think that this discussion is actually quite important.
I'll just piggyback on that because it was so smart. 2 points. One is, it's not a partisan statement, it's a factual statement, unfortunately, that this question of our ability to build coalitions right now is under a cloud. I'm going to be in Brussels very shortly, and one of the things people there are asking to talk to me about is just this. As people try and understand the Trump administration, which does business differently than previous administrations did, and what they can expect under this administration and where it is on Russia and things like that. And so that puts us in a little bit of a strange position, at least in the near term. I completely agree with Danny that I don't see any reason why in the near term our ability to use this kind of economic power is going to be put at risk. That's not to say that we should be complacent about it. In the past, when we thought about what would be the consequences of taking action against elements of the international oil economy in Iran, and would that lead to the international oil economy leaving the dollar? What would be the consequence of taking action against a government's central bank? The discussions that we had, very thoughtful discussions, then were exactly what we need to be doing. You don't jump into these things. You assess very carefully what the consequences and potential unintended consequences could be, so that you don't find yourself waking up one morning and saying, oops, I overplayed my hand. I do think we need to think also a little more strategically about ways in which maybe we can think about tools, defensive tools that we might need. The key defensive tool that we've had to date is a different type, Section 311 of the Patriot Act, trying to keep insufficiently protected economies from being able to access the United States and kind of bring the viruses they might allow in there in here. It gets to my earlier point where we need to make clear what our tools are all about. Most people thought the 311 was an offensive tool, and we had to spend a lot of time describing how it actually was intended to protect the U.S. economy. What other types of things might we be able to do to protect not only the economy, but protect our tool set? And there I think one thing we need to think about in the near term is how are some of these sanctions that you did talk about, say targeting South Korea, how are they affecting some of our key allies, and what are things that we might be able to do to mitigate some of those consequences, both to be able to build and maintain better coalitions, but also to be able to protect not just ourselves, but our allies within our coalition from the economic powers that some of our, not necessarily adversaries, but other countries that are not exactly in our coalition are trying to impose. Adam says yes.
Adam says yes. So building off. None of them like me. Every time it comes to my hand, it just turns off. Building off of that set of comments, I mean, do you think that there's a place in government right now, in particular in relation to China, for things like CFIUS reform or a CFIUS Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States meant to block threatening strategic investment into the United States? Institutional reform that the United States could undertake to better protect itself? And if so, what do you think that broadly looks like? Sam, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, on the CFIUS, I mean, understanding which we have barely begun to scratch the surface of, the tools and capabilities, platforms, and analysis that we need to understand Chinese strategy for undermining key economic components of our country's wherewithal, right? So it's not scattershot in the past that sometimes CFIUS has been, this one we'll do, this one we won't, but really, understanding and prioritizing which ones. How do we go through a CFIUS process with the full scale and scope of understanding adversarial strategy? That's a tall order that has to be filled, but that's where we have to get to, so that we do this with some semblance of, of an ordered understanding of we want investment in our economy, but we need to balance that out against the adversary potentially getting in our economy to hurt us. And we are not there yet.
Yeah, hello there. I certainly don't disagree with that. And I mean, as somebody who for many years had to sign off on CFIUS cases, I certainly am very aware of all the flaws and deficiencies in CFIUS. And I think if people want to try to reform it, it certainly could benefit from being more streamlined and more targeted, and more focused on what the real threats to our economy are. I do want to just a note of caution when we talk about things like CFIUS. The main reason why Chinese investors want to invest in the United States is because the United States is a great place to do business, and the United States is a great place to invest. That the main reason why Chinese investors invest in the United States is not to undermine the U.S. economy. They invest in the U.S. economy because they have confidence in the U.S. economy, and that helps us in any number of ways. It helps us all of our lives. Everybody in this room benefits from that, and we also, if we really want to weaken the dollar, if we're really serious about weakening the dollar and making our sanctions ineffective, then let's stop. Let's close the U.S. to foreign investment. That would be a good place to start. I just think that we need to be cautious when we start talking about regulating trade. That we do need to protect ourselves, and we do need to be smart about it, but we need to be focused, and we need to understand how much we benefit from foreign investment in the United States.
And question sort of pivoting back to the discussion of our use of economic statecraft, our sort of offensive use of economic statecraft. You have all been instrumental in the ramp up of U.S. economic power in the past 15 years, in the post sort of 9/11 era. Are there lessons you take from that? Are there lessons that you think sanctions and offensive cyber economic capability, sort of lessons that have really sort of shown themselves to you during that period of time? So, for example, what would sort of be one lesson that you would want to share with members of Congress and the executive about what you've learned over the past 15 years in using sanctions or other types of economic statecraft?
one would certainly be the need for flexibility, which we touched on earlier. The keep your eyes on the prize with sanctions. This isn't about a press release that you've just smacked somebody or designated companies or frozen funds. It's a means to an end, as I think Matt was saying. It's a way of trying to change behavior, and we have to preserve that leverage, which means we have to preserve flexibility. A second lesson learned is exploit the asymmetries. And that's important when thinking about how to shape the sanctions based on the target you're confronting. And Danny, I think very wisely talked about the differences here between sub-state and the difference between state actors. You may be best positioned in terms of influencing behavior to focus, when you're focusing on a government, on status-based or broad sanctions. In other contexts, you might be best positioned to focus on conduct, maybe because it lets you marshal a coalition more easily. But always keep your eye on behavioral change and think about what the sanctions are intended to do. And then on the point of asymmetry, I think we have to think about what are the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, the dependencies of individual targets. And those do differ dramatically. If you're looking at a narcotics cartel, hitting them where it hurts means hitting them in the wallet. And our financial sanctions are very well matched to do that, and I think have been successful for just that reason. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of work, intelligence, law enforcement work that fuels those successes, but it's a tool that's well suited to the adversary. When you're talking about cyber criminals, it's much more challenging terrain. You know, if you have a bunch of 18-year-olds working out of a garage who might be performing on a contract basis for a state or a sub-state actor, how vulnerable are they to financial sanctions, to having their names, even if you can figure out what their names are, added to an OFAC list? Well, that's not the same animal. We're talking about something very different. And the point about asymmetries also comes to bear when you talk about a place like North Korea. And I'm sure we've all read things and heard people talk about, well, North Korea is sanctions proof because they're a pariah state. They don't trade with the US, they don't need anybody. Well, the reality is they're incredibly dependent on inputs from foreign countries. It's not from the US, we don't trade with them, but they are not self-reliant at all as an economy, as a producer, as an energy consumer. And so the dependencies are there. You just have to look at where those lines go. In the case of North Korea, they almost entirely go to China. So the question becomes, as Danny was saying, how do you enlist, coerce, cajole China into taking a qualitatively different position vis-a-vis North Korea? But that's an example of what I mean when I talk about look for the asymmetries, look for the dependencies, and it's there that you'll find the sanctions that have the best chance of working.
I just added one more way to look at this, and that is some sanctions are intended to have strategic impact, like bringing Iran to the table, and some are intended to have a tactical impact, like disrupting terrorist or narcotics networks. And you're going to deploy those differently. Again, we need to describe what we're doing. People tend to think of all sanctions as the same, and they're very much not. Especially on the tactical side, I've long felt, again, I believe very strongly, you don't want to overplay your hand, you got to be careful, but on some of our tactical sanctions, sometimes we've been approaching a particular terrorist group, we'll do a sanction or two or three, and then a long time goes by. A campaign that would be much more effective would be, you know, like when you're in the boxing ring, you don't hit just once and then dance away, you hit a whole bunch of times. It gets intelligence driven, there's a lot of law enforcement work, but there are plenty of cases where I think we could be more aggressive, in particular in how we use our tactical sanctions tools, even as, and this might be the most important takeaway of the day for those who are new to this, and that is that sanctions, tactical or strategic, will never solve your problem, certainly not alone. It is a tool that is part of a much larger toolkit and always has to be used in tandem with other tools. I can't tell you how many times since leaving government, but how many times in government, I had to explain to people that this was not going to solve our problem. This was not a panacea. This was not a hard problem. We don't know what to do. Surely Treasury can designate something. That's not the right way to use our tools. I do think when it comes to the tactical tools in particular, we could in some cases be even much more aggressive.
Hello, there we. Anything? I'm just going to say a couple of things, but it's really just building upon the points that Matt and Adam made, and I agree with them on everything that they said. The way I articulate the point that Matt just made is that, sanctions aren't a strategy. Sanctions are a tool in service of a strategy, and if your strategy is sanctions, you don't have a strategy. So we need to first make sure we understand what our strategy is, and then go about deploying the sanctions in support of that strategy. And so that's, I think, a real key point. And Matt is certainly right. There is a tendency within government to rely maybe too heavily on sanctions. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the main being that it's something that you can do. It's something you could do that's overt. For those of you who haven't served in the executive branch of government before, never underestimate the pressure that government officials feel to act. And there's a tremendous amount of pressure on people in government to act in response to a perceived crisis or to a perceived threat. And oftentimes there's not a lot of good things you can do, but you almost can always roll out a sanction. And as I sometimes refer to it disparagingly, sort of press release by sanction. That's sort of a fact of life, and I think it's something that we just sort of is almost the cost of doing business at a certain point. But even as we're engaging in sanction as press release or press release as sanction, we need to keep in mind what is the strategy, what are we trying to achieve, and then devise a sophisticated financial pressure strategy to go along with that will include sanctions and will include other tools that we have as well. And I'll just say one other point emerging from that, but picking up on what Adam said, and that is how sophisticated we can be in the application of these sanctions. There's a very, very standard sort of off-the-shelf sanction, our general sort of asset freeze transaction ban sanction, which is quite appropriate in many instances. But when we were at the Treasury called upon to devise a sanctions economic financial pressure plan with respect to Russia, it's some of the work that I'm frankly most proud of, and putting the sort of the politics of or the strategy of what you think about Russia's incursions into Ukraine and our response to it. It was by far and away the most sophisticated sanctions response the Treasury has ever had to a particular target. And it was really the first time, and Adam and I were both at Treasury for 15 years working on these issues, it was the first time that there was a real partnership between the security guys like me and Adam and Matt and the real international economists at the Treasury Department, where we really sat down and we really thought hard about what Russia's vulnerabilities were and how do you target those vulnerabilities and how do we do it in a way that protects ourselves. And I think that's a model that really needs to be studied by the new team that's coming in there. And I'm glad the new team is going to be in there in the next few days. But that's a model that I really hope they take a close look at. Not necessarily the exact things that we did are always going to be the appropriate things to do in each case, but the process that we went through to be extremely sophisticated in our response, I thought was showed how much we had evolved as a building, as the Treasury Department, in addressing a threat.
Very, very quickly, one.
Much pressure on you, but you have the last word, Dr. Ravitch.
I love Matt's configuration that if all you have are sanctions, you don't have a strategy. I think.
But I'll take it. It's mine. Mine now.
Yes. But I think there's a corollary, which goes something inartfully like this. And if you don't think clearly on how you are going to unwind existing sanctions, you are in peril of undermining any strategy you do have. And on that point, I would encourage all of you who don't know the history of BDA, Banco Delta Asia, to look at it. Understand, on the first instance, the hard work and the thoughtfulness that went actually into crafting the sanctions on BDA, the importance of them, and then look at how they were completely thrown under the bus for other reasons, and I would argue actually undermined not only our strategy on North Korea, but our other strategies going on around the world to constrain other hostile regimes. So I would really, really encourage that. Take a look at that.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much for joining us. And please, let's give the panelists an applause for a really illuminating session. Thank you.